Before we get started, I want to take just a moment to tell you what this is. This is Dauphin Island Diaries, where we tell the stories of the Gulf Coast. Stories shaped by water, weather, and the passage of time. One place, one moment, one narrative at a time. If you enjoy place-based history, stories tied to real locations you can visit, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X, where we release short-form videos from these same sites throughout the week, every week. Now, let's get into the story. Welcome to Dauphin Island Diaries. This is a podcast dedicated to the history of Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Gulf Coast that surrounds it. Twice each month, we bring you a story about the people, the places, and the moments that have shaped this island, and the waters and coastline beyond it. Some of these stories are well known. Others have been buried by time and storms and shifting shorelines, but they're still here. So wherever you are, whether you're on the island, remembering it, or discovering it for the first time, find a comfortable place, take a deep breath, relax, and settle in, because this is one of those stories. They're still here. So wherever you are, whether you're on the island, remembering it, or discovering it for the first time, find a comfortable place, take a deep breath, relax, and settle in, because this is one of those stories. They're called snowbirds. This is a term applied to someone from the north who winters in more temperate climates in the south in order to escape the cold and snow and ice. Much of the modern-day population of Dauphin Island are seasonal transients. Certainly there are many folks who visit the island during the tourist seasons, such as for spring bird watching and banding season, and spring breaks, which encompasses about 8 weeks, for the annual fishing rodeo, and for several other events throughout the year. But there are also a significant number of folks from northern areas who spend the winter months, the winter season, on the island and around the area. And they do this in RVs and multiple campgrounds and RV parks on the island and near, in multiple condos on the island. A number of them own homes on the island that they spend several months out of the year in. But these seasonal transients aren't the first such in the history of the island. The oldest man-made, we'll call them structures, the oldest man-made structures on the island speak to an earlier group of transients, a prehistoric transient people who archaeologists believe made a regular pilgrimage to winter on the island, much like the snowbirds do today. These were the Bottle Creek people, those whom we might call the original snowbirds. In this case, I'm applying the term in a tongue-in-cheek way, to be sure, to people from the Mississippian era, these indigenous people who left the Bottle Creek area near modern-day Stockton, Alabama, not the north, and no, they didn't have snow typically, but they're still several miles north of what is today modern-day Dauphin Island. And they came down to winter on the island. Now, Bottle Creek is an indigenous Mounds site near, as we said earlier, Stockton, Alabama, in the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. It's about 20 miles above modern-day Mobile, and this site is, as noted, from the Mississippian era, or the Mississippian period. This site is approximately 50 to 55 miles north, as the crow flies, from the shell mounds on Dauphin Island. And at the Bottle Creek area, there are 18 or so mounds located there. Archaeologists believe that it was occupied from about 1250 AD onward, well into the 18th century. And it was an important site for indigenous people such as the Mobilians, from whom Mobile, Alabama takes its name. It's believed to have served as the principal political and religious center for the region, which extended all the way down to the Gulf into modern-day Pensacola, into that area, and across into at least modern-day southern Mississippi. Of all the mound sites in Alabama, Bottle Creek is considered to be second in importance only to Moundville near Tuscaloosa. These are the people who archaeologists believe began building, and that's in my air quotes, the shell mounds. And I use air quotes there because even though building is what they did, it was actually more piling up their trash than building houses or other types of what we would normally consider structures or buildings. The mounds that they built are called middens, which means they're trash heaps. These are where the people piled the refuse from harvesting oysters and fish. And for the record, archaeologists love trash piles of ancient peoples because that's where you get to see how the people of that time were living. You see in what they throw away, what tools they used, what they were eating, how they were adapting. And conversely, what's not there tells you what they weren't using or eating or so forth. Archaeologists have theorized that the Bottle Creek people were going to the north shore of Dauphin Island because it may have provided a kind of security. There was plenty of food, and it seems that there were lots of oysters and fish available in what is today known as Little Dauphin Island Sound, or also known as Dauphin Island Bay. At that time, scientists believed that the water level would have been at least a foot lower, which would have made the bay shallower and would have made it easier to harvest the oysters. So this was a place where they generally would have had plenty to eat. This was a place to smoke those fish and oysters to preserve them for future use. This was a place to spend the winter in relatively temperate climates. If there were issues with famine, with drought, with floods, some other reason for times of food shortage in their home area around Bottle Creek, then Dauphin Island seems that it would have been a place to fall back on to ensure that their food stocks were maintained. And because these people used this location year after year after year after year, century after century after century, these middens grew substantially over time. I'd like to pause just for a moment to tell you, if you're enjoying these stories, you need to know what you're missing out on if you're not subscribed to our premium Patreon package, Dolphin Documentarian. Right now, we're releasing exclusive full-length interviews with people closest to these stories along the Gulf Coast. That includes Robert Bean, ranger at Fort Gaines, walking through the history and significance of one of the most important fortifications in Mobile Bay, and John Maresco with the Marine Resources Division of Alabama Conservation and Natural Resources, discussing the Indian shell mounds on Dauphin Island and what they reveal about the people who lived here long before any fort was ever built. These aren't short clips. They're full conversations and go much deeper than what we can include in the main episodes. Plus, we share other materials such as videos and photographs from these sites, most of which are only being shared here. So if you want the deeper story behind the stories, that's available for our premium Patreon supporters. You can find that link in the show notes. And now, let's get back into today's story. When the archaeologists have done research in the middens, they found that they typically have multiple layers. Layers of shells, layers of broken pottery called potsherds, and other refuse, and layers of charcoal where they had fires. These middens were originally in something of a serpentine ring, similar to rings found throughout the southeast on the coast, particularly in South Carolina and Georgia. Part of the ring in the middens on Dauphin Island have been destroyed, though. More on that later. This also appears to have been an area where trade with other parts of the Gulf and the Southeast went on. because there are a number of non-native plants in the area of the shell mounds. At least one source indicates that some of the plants in the area are from the Yucatan Peninsula of modern-day Mexico. Also, at least one source indicates that there are plants in the shell mounds that are normally found in the Appalachian regions. All this said, I wasn't able definitively to find anything that identified exactly what these non-native plants are. One type of plant that does appear there that is native to the area, there are a number of magnificent old live oaks on the shell mounds and in the area. These are massive, and estimates are that they're close to 200 to 300 years old. I've seen at least one source stating that some of these trees are at least 800 years old, and that they were already mature trees when the first Europeans arrived in the area. This is highly unlikely. As a general rule, live oaks tend to live 200 to 300 years on average, and some will occasionally reach 400 to 500 years old. But 800 years old for a live oak is pretty much unheard of. One story about the live oaks that's told is that there evidently was one of those trees in this area that was the site for marriages for some of the indigenous people. These were called giveaways or hand fasting. Often these would occur around a sacred fire, and these rituals honored the sacred witness of the tree in the ceremony. It's possible, of course, but unlikely that this tree is still in existence in the shell mound area if this practice was observed in the area more than a couple of hundred years ago. Nevertheless, that there are old live oaks there in that area means that if none of them are that actual live oak tree used in these ceremonies, then the trees that are there are likely the descendants of that old oak. And then, at some point, and I don't know that anyone is sure exactly when this started, the Mississippian people who were creating these middens began to use at least some of them as burial sites. These particular middens have not been extensively examined for burials. However, archaeologists did discover at least a small number of remains, human remains, in a portion of the mounds and some limited excavations that were done there. And based on at least one situation that happened during the island's history, it's likely that some of the mounds were fairly extensively used for this practice. Again, more on that shortly. At some point, the peoples of the Mississippian period disappeared. Whether they died out or moved away or were assimilated later into some other historic period tribes, that's unclear. Nevertheless, the tribes of the historic periods, that is, those who were on the island when the first European settlers arrived, began using the island in much the same way as those earlier peoples had done, as a place to gather food. It also was most definitely a calumet site as well. Now, the word calumet comes from the French word calumet, meaning reed or pipe. It's a term used to describe a site where the peace pipe would be shared. It's come to be a broader term used to apply generically to any place where intertribal peace was observed, regardless of whether a pipe was actually involved or not. For the tribes of the historic period, such as the Choctaw and the Muskogees, who are commonly known in the area as the Creeks, this seems to have been a site for different peoples to meet on peaceful terms. And in the case of the shell mounds, calumet was not a generic term. It's actually a documented site where indigenous tribes and French explorers smoked to seal alliances, most notably in 1717. These middens may have been among the highest points on the island when they were at their peak usage. And this speaks to just how much they've been used over the centuries, because some of the middens even now are several feet tall, 10 to 12 feet, perhaps even more in some cases. So this also means that during flooding or storm surge, the middens might actually have been among the safest places to be. That said, it likely was storms eroding some of the middens where burials had occurred that resulted in the island's first name given to it by Europeans, Isle Massacre or Massacre Island. At the end of January 1699, French explorer Pierre Le Moyne Sieur d'Iberville came into the area. And as he and his men passed by what is now Bala Battery and Cedar Point, they encountered what we now call Dauphin Island. As they arrived, they discovered a large pile of bones, possibly from as many as 60 men and women. Presuming these remains to be the result of a slaughter, Iberville called the island Isle Massacre. As noted already, just a few years later, the mounds were then a place for the French explorers to meet with indigenous tribes in the area in 1717 to negotiate with them. And it was definitely at this point, if not before, that the site became a calumet site through that meeting and through the agreements that were sealed through the smoking of the pipe. How much the mounds continued to be used throughout the colonial period, though, isn't well documented that I was able to find. Let's take a short break and let me share with you that throughout the month of April, we're covering a range of stories from across Dauphin Island and the Gulf Coast. That includes the complicated story of Fort Gaines, where we look at how one of the most significant structures on the island came to be, and the role it played in the defense of Mobile Bay. And also ancient snowbirds, where we explore how the first human structures on Dauphin Island were created and what they reveal about the people who built them and what they still mean to the island today. Each of these stories is tied to real places, real people, and real events. And each one has its own unique place in the history of this stretch of the Gulf Coast. So if this is your kind of history, there's a lot more ahead. Now, let's continue our story. It's not until the early years of the U.S. possession of the island that the usage of the mounds is again noted. This time, though, not in the way that the indigenous people had used them. In 1821, as noted in the previous episode, construction began on Fort Gaines, and that continued in fits and starts throughout the next 3 decades. At least one account that I've come across indicates that the area of the mound ring that's now missing is the result of mining the mounds for material for making mortar for the construction of the fort. Just as with the materials extracted from Greek and Roman ruins by later Europeans, structures that were created by indigenous peoples, whether as mere trash heaps or as intentional structures, have been seen as viable sources of building materials throughout the history of the development of the United States. And it would appear that the shell mounds on Dauphin Island are no different. The term for this practice is spolia, and it's been practiced by peoples probably since long before records were ever kept. So, if that's how part of the mounds were destroyed, or even if it were for some other project, I'll say this very clearly. This is sad. This is tragic in many ways, but it's by no means an isolated incident. Throughout the rest of the 1800s and early 1900s, the small number of residents of the island ran livestock such as goats and cattle. These animals kept much of the vegetation that now extensively covers the mounds grazed down such that the mounds were much more clearly visible than they are now. Even in the 1960s and 70s, the mounds were clearly visible for residents of the island. At some point, the state of Alabama assumed ownership of the site, and it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1973. Today, most of the shell mounds are part of the Indian Shell Mound Park, which is administered by the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. A small portion of them are on the property of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration facility that is adjacent to the park. And so that brings us up to the present. And I'll say this, I find this interesting. And that is, in spite of the large numbers of bird watchers and nature lovers who visit the area, and there are quite a few of those every year, but in spite of them, the Indian Shell Mound Park is perhaps one of the island's best kept secrets. I've talked to quite a few people who have been to the island several times and have never visited it even once. And the same is even true for many of the locals. I had a brief conversation with Dauphin Island Mayor Jeff Collier, who grew up on the island, and he said that when he was growing up, his parents instructed him not to go there, presumably due to there being burials in at least part of them. But in the years since livestock was on the island and grazing and keeping everything, we'll say, mowed down, the shell mounds have become an unruly and beautiful mass of vegetation that's a haven for birds of all types. And it's also a haven for the bird watchers who delight in observing them, photographing them, and documenting them. And this is partly because Dauphin Island is uniquely located for what are called fallout events. These events happen mostly in the springtime of the year when northward flying migratory birds encounter bad weather such as storms or stiff headwinds. These types of events lead the migrating birds to fall out to the nearest available landmass for rest and refeeding. For birds migrating across the Gulf of Mexico, or if you prefer, the Gulf of America, the first such landmass for many of these birds is Dauphin Island. And so these exhausted birds stop on Dauphin Island to rest, to recuperate, to eat, and to build their strength back up so that they can continue their journey. And so as such, Dauphin Island, the entire island, is a bird sanctuary in one sense of the word. But there are several designated natural areas that are preserved around the island to serve as sanctuaries for these migratory birds. And the Indian Shell Mounds Park is one such location. Not only does the park have, as we've already described, lots of trees and vegetation for these birds to take sanctuary in, it also has hiking trails crisscrossing the mounds. There are these large live oak trees there as well as other types of trees. There are also numerous memorial park benches that are scattered throughout the park that are available for people who are bird watching and like to sit and just meditate and enjoy the natural surroundings there. But during these fallout events, the Indian Shell Mounds Park is a haven for many such migratory birds there. It's also a very peaceful place. Even when there are several folks at the site, people tend to speak in hushed tones and to honor the presence of nature. And of course, as we've already mentioned, there are sure to be at least a few bird watchers there nearly any time you visit. Interestingly, there also is now a pair of bald eagles in the area. There's a communication tower that's on the shore between the Conservation and Natural Resources facility and the FDA facility. The bald eagles like to perch atop that tower. They've also engaged in nesting on that tower in times past as well, and unfortunately, those nests can't be permitted to remain. Bald eagle nests are built over time, and they're built up over time. And as a result, they can become massive. And as a result, they can become very, very heavy. These are generally constructed of very large limbs and sticks and even small logs, and they're built in layers. As each brood grows to maturity, to be frank, the nest fills with excrement and debris. And so new layers are simply built on top of the old, and thus the weight of the nest becomes immense over time. If allowed to remain, this would damage the communication tower in time. So whenever the birds try to create a nest on that tower, this has to be removed. If you'd like to support what we're doing here, we do have merchandise available through the Summers Media Enterprises website. It's a simple way to support the work and help us continue traveling, researching, and telling these stories. Plus, you get to pick up some cool swag that lets you show everybody what your new favorite podcast is. You can find that link in the show notes as well, and we appreciate your support. There's also an alligator who lives in the pond that exists between the Indian shell mounds and the front of the Conservation and Natural Resources Office. It's become quite used to people being around. Now, it's important to remember that this alligator is still a wild animal nonetheless. Tourists sometimes get pretty close to it, often with small children, so that they can take selfies with it. This is not wise. And ultimately, it's potentially dangerous not only to the people doing it, it's also dangerous to the alligator. Because if people did something that resulted in it attacking people, it likely would have to be killed. It would at least have to be relocated. So, if you come to see the alligator, please be smart and keep a safe distance from it. In the 1950s and 60s, the Intra-Coastal Waterway was created. And as part of the creation of this commercial shipping system, canals were dug where there was no previous waterway, and channels were dredged to make deeper waterways where waterways already existed. These changes certainly facilitated and enhanced commercial maritime traffic, but they also had the unintended consequences of changing estuarine ecology of Mobile Bay, Bon Secours Bay, the Mississippi Sound, Dauphin Island Bay, and elsewhere. So the conditions that for centuries had been so perfect for the Bottle Creek people to harvest all the oysters and fish that they needed to sustain them no longer exist as they did then. In some parts of the region, the oysters are returning. Bila Battery on the other side of the Mississippi Sound is seeing a resurgence in oyster production, such as with oyster farms like Murder Point Oysters and others, but they're not naturally occurring in Dauphin Island Bay in the numbers remotely resembling previous centuries. I say all that to say this. Those conditions that led the Bottle Creek people to winter on what's now Dauphin Island, and by and through which they created the shell mounds there, those no longer exist. So once again, what was no longer is, and is now something else. Such is the case for the shell mounds on Dauphin Island and the Indian Shell Mound Park where they're found. So that's going to do it for today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through time with the oldest structure on Dauphin Island. If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy this week's episode on our sister podcast, The Tennessee History Nerd, The Fort That Wasn't. In that episode, we're looking at an ancient woodland Indian structure found in Old Stone Fort State Archaeological Park at the confluence of the Duck and Little Duck Rivers in Middle Tennessee, and what was first believed by European settlers to be a fortification. You can find that episode under The Tennessee History Nerd on all podcast platforms. In a couple of weeks, we'll be back with another episode of Dauphin Island Diaries. This time we'll be looking at something that's very timely with the SS United States due to go soon back out of Mobile Bay past Dauphin Island on her final journey to become an artificial reef. We'll be looking at artificial reefs in the Gulf. I hope you'll be watching for that episode to drop when we again explore where memories intermingle with the sand, the waves, and the wind. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, and these are Dauphin Island Diaries. May you enjoy fair winds today and a beautiful Dauphin Island sunset. Before we close things out, I want to take just a moment to acknowledge the sources behind this episode. This story draws from a combination of archaeological research, historical writing, and modern interpretation of the Dauphin Island shell mounds. I leaned heavily on academic work related to shell mound archaeology in the southeastern United States, including Rebecca Saunders' chapter, Archaic Shell Mounds in the American Southeast, from the Oxford Handbook of Topics in Archaeology. That work provides important context for how archaeologists understand shell mounds, not just as refuse piles, but as meaningful cultural landscapes tied to ritual, community, and long-term use. For regional context, I use material from the Encyclopedia of Alabama entry on the Bottle Creek site, which helped establish the importance of that site as a political and cultural center in the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. I also referenced interpretive material from the University of Alabama's Office of Archaeological Research, along with additional historical summaries and archived articles related to the Dauphin Island shell mounds and their use over time. Some of the interpretive framing in this episode, particularly the idea of seasonal movement to the island and the role of shellfish as a reliable food source, draws from archaeological interpretations attributed to Dr. Gregory Wassilkov and others working in this region. For more local historical perspective, I consulted A History of Dauphin Island Under 5 Flags by Francis Young, which provides insight into how the island has been used and understood across different periods. I also made use of a variety of coastal and environmental resources related to Dauphin Island, including material on the island's role as a migratory bird habitat and its designation as part of Alabama's coastal conservation system. Finally, I'm very appreciative of John Maresca of the Alabama Marine Resources Division of the Conservation and Natural Resources Department, who took the time to talk at length with me about the Indian Shell Mound Park, including giving me a guided tour around the area. Boots on the ground provide perspective that can't be obtained any other way. As always, where the historical record is incomplete, I do my best to clearly distinguish between established fact and reasonable interpretation. Before we close, I want to address something directly. This episode has been revised and re-recorded because a small portion of the information I initially used proved to be inaccurate. Specifically, I'd stated, both in a video and in an earlier version of this episode, that some of the live oaks at the shell mounds were likely 800 years old. That claim came from one of my sources. After reviewing additional evidence, I determined that that information was, at best, incorrect. So I corrected it. The script has been updated, the episode has been re-recorded, and I'll reshoot and reissue the corresponding video the next time I'm on Dauphin Island. If you're hearing this after May 2026, that should already have been done. I want you to understand something clearly. When I determine that something I've said is wrong, I'll correct it. That's not optional. There will be times when the information I present is incomplete or even incorrect, despite my best efforts. When that happens, I'll fix it, even if it's inconvenient, even if it's not popular. I'm far less concerned with being popular than being correct. As Henry Clay is often quoted as saying, I would rather be right than be president. In my case, I'd rather be right than popular. That also means that there will be times when I won't agree with every suggested correction. I do review those, but if I don't issue a correction, it's because I've weighed the evidence and determined that the original statement still stands. It's not possible to agree with everyone, and it's not my goal to. My goal is to find and share the truth as best I can. In this case, the feedback I received led me back to the evidence, and the evidence showed that a correction was warranted. So I made it, here in the episode, in the social media post, and soon in the video as well. And I do appreciate that feedback when it's needed. May we always allow room for thoughtful discussion and differing perspectives, but let's always be anchored to the truth. Dauphin Island Diaries is part of Summers Media Enterprises. In addition to the podcast, we produce short-form historical video content from locations across the Gulf Coast, which you can find on our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and X. I'm also available on a limited basis for speaking engagements, presentations, and educational events. So if you're interested in having us speak or collaborate with you, you can find more information through the links in the show notes. And thanks again for listening.